The old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 6 in the evening, its deep chimes echoing through the empty farmhouse. Robert Chen set down his coffee cup and stared out the kitchen window at the overgrown garden that stretched toward the barn. 3 years ago, that same view would have shown neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and beans. His wife Margaret had spent countless hours out there, her hands dirty with soil and her face bright with satisfaction. Now weeds choked the raised beds, and wild vines climbed over the wooden fence posts she had painted white every spring. Robert couldn't bring himself to tend the garden anymore. Every time he stepped outside with gardening tools, memories flooded back so strongly that his chest felt tight and his hands shook. The kitchen felt too big for one person. The round oak table where he sat had 4 chairs, but 3 of them hadn't been used in months. Margaret's favorite chair still had the small cushion she had sewn herself, decorated with yellow sunflowers. Robert never sat in that chair. Sometimes he caught himself setting 2 plates on the table out of habit, then quietly putting one back in the cabinet. His dog Scout, a black and white border collie, lay on his bed by the back door. At 12 years old, Scout moved slowly and spent most of his time sleeping. The dog had been Margaret's companion during her long walks around the property. Now Scout seemed as lost as Robert felt, often standing by the front door as if waiting for someone who would never come home. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, mostly empty except for milk that often went sour before Robert finished it, some leftover takeout from the diner in town, and a few cans of dog food. Robert had stopped cooking real meals after Margaret died. What was the point of making a pot roast or baking bread when there was no one to share it with? He lived on sandwiches, canned soup, and whatever the ladies from church brought over, though their visits had become less frequent as time passed. His phone sat silent on the counter. His daughter called every Sunday evening from California, and his son checked in on Wednesdays from Texas. They worried about him, he knew. During their last conversation, his daughter had suggested he consider selling the farm and moving to a retirement community closer to family. The idea made Robert feel sick to his stomach. This house held 42 years of memories. Margaret had picked out the kitchen cabinets. They had painted every room together. She had planted the apple tree by the front porch to celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. But the house felt like a museum now, full of artifacts from a life that no longer existed. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the coffee table next to her favorite mystery novel. Bookmarked on page 127, her coffee mug, the blue one with tiny white flowers, remained in its spot by the kitchen sink. Robert washed it every few days but never used it. Her clothes still hung in the closet and her perfume bottle sat on the dresser, though the scent had long since faded. The evenings were the hardest. That's when Margaret used to tell him about her day while they prepared dinner together. She would share gossip from her volunteer work at the library, or talk about the progress in her garden, or read interesting parts from whatever book she was enjoying. The silence now felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. Robert tried to fill the quiet with television, but most shows reminded him of programs he and Margaret had watched together. The news was too depressing, and the comedies felt hollow when there was no one to laugh with. He had tried reading, but his mind wandered after a few pages. Sometimes he played solitaire at the kitchen table, but even that reminded him of the card games he and Margaret had enjoyed on winter evenings. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. The bed felt too large, and Robert often found himself lying awake listening to the old house settle and creak. Sometimes he talked to Margaret in the darkness, telling her about his day or asking her opinion about small decisions. He knew it wasn't healthy, but it brought a small comfort in the overwhelming loneliness. The farm still required some basic maintenance. Robert fed the handful of chickens Margaret had kept, though he had stopped collecting the eggs regularly. Sometimes he found them spoiled in the nesting boxes days later. The small vegetable patch near the back door had yielded a few tomatoes and squash earlier in the summer, but Robert let most of them rot on the vine. Cooking for one person felt pointless, and giving away the extras meant talking to neighbors, which required energy he didn't have. His truck sat in the driveway, and he drove to town only when absolutely necessary for groceries or supplies. The 20-minute drive felt longer now because he had no one to talk to during the journey. Margaret used to point out changes in the scenery, comment on neighbors' yards, or remind him to stop at the post office. Now he drove in silence, the radio offering little comfort. People in town treated him differently now. They spoke more softly, asked how he was doing with concerned expressions, and often seemed unsure what to say. Robert understood they meant well, but their sympathy reminded him constantly of his loss. It was easier to keep trips brief and avoid long conversations. The mailbox at the end of the driveway collected mostly bills and advertisements. Margaret used to love getting letters from friends and family, and she always sorted through the mail with interest. Now Robert grabbed the envelopes without enthusiasm, often letting them pile up on the kitchen counter for days before opening them. Some days, Robert wondered what the point was, not in a dangerous way, but in a tired, empty way that made everything feel meaningless. He had raised his children, built a good life with Margaret, and worked hard for decades. Now what? His children had their own lives, his wife was gone, and the future stretched ahead like a long, lonely road with no clear destination. The house held too many memories and too much silence. Every room contained echoes of conversations, laughter, and the comfortable sounds of shared life. The kitchen remembered breakfast discussions about daily plans. The living room held memories of evening television and quiet talks. The bedroom carried the weight of 40 years of whispered conversations before sleep. As darkness fell outside the kitchen window, Robert rinsed his coffee cup and turned off the lights. Scout followed him slowly toward the bedroom, both of them moving through their nightly routine without enthusiasm. Tomorrow would bring another day of silence, another day of going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. Robert had no idea that his life was about to change completely. He couldn't have imagined that within days his quiet farmhouse would ring with children's laughter and the warm sounds of a busy family. He couldn't have known that his broken heart was about to be healed by people he had never met, in ways he never expected. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, with October wind rattling the windows of Robert's farmhouse. He had put off his grocery trip for 3 days, but the refrigerator was nearly empty, and Scout was down to his last can of dog food. Robert pulled on his worn jacket and drove into town, dreading the necessary interactions with store clerks and neighbors. The supermarket felt overwhelming after days of solitude. Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the aisles seemed longer than he remembered. Robert moved slowly through the store with his short list, picking up basics: bread, milk, canned soup, and dog food. He avoided the produce section where Margaret used to spend 20 minutes carefully selecting the best vegetables. The frozen dinner aisle had become his new normal, though the meals never tasted like real food. At the checkout counter, Mrs. Williams from the church smiled sympathetically and asked how he was managing. Robert nodded politely and mumbled that he was fine, though they both knew it wasn't true. He paid quickly and loaded his few bags into the truck, eager to return to the quiet of his farm. But as he drove past the community food bank on Elm Street, something caught his attention. The building was clearly closed for the day, but 4 small figures huddled together on the front steps. Robert slowed his truck and saw a young woman sitting with 3 children pressed close against her for warmth. Their clothes looked thin for the chilly weather, and even from a distance he could see they were shivering. Robert's first instinct was to drive past. He had his own problems and didn't need to get involved in someone else's troubles. But something made him pull over to the curb. Maybe it was the way the woman held the children protectively, or how small they looked in the growing darkness. It reminded him of a time years ago when his own family had been stranded during a snowstorm, and a stranger had helped them. He sat in his truck for a moment, engine running, debating with himself. Margaret would have gotten out immediately to help. She never could pass by someone in need without stopping. But Robert felt rusty at talking to strangers, especially in difficult situations. What would he even say? Finally, he turned off the engine and walked toward the small group. As he got closer, he could see that the woman was probably in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. The 3 children looked to be about the same age, maybe 4 or 5 years old. They had the same dark eyes and olive skin as their mother, and they watched him approach with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The woman looked up as his shadow fell across them. Her face was streaked with tears and her eyes held a desperation that made Robert's chest tighten. She clutched a small backpack and what looked like a plastic bag containing a few belongings. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, starting to gather the children closer. "We're not causing trouble. We'll move along." "Wait," Robert said, his voice rougher than he intended after hours of not speaking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman's expression shifted from fear to cautious hope. "The food bank was supposed to be open until 5, but when we got here it was already closed. We don't have anywhere else to go tonight." Robert looked at the children more carefully. They were definitely triplets, 2 girls and a boy, with the same round faces and serious expressions. Their clothes were clean but worn, and none of them had adequate jackets for the weather. The smallest girl was sucking her thumb, and all 3 stayed close to their mother's side. "What's your name?" Robert asked the woman. "Angela," she replied. "Angela Rodriguez. These are my children, Rosa, Miguel, and Carmen." She gestured to each child as she spoke their names. "I'm Robert," he said. "Where are you folks from?" Angela's voice caught as she explained. "We lived about an hour north of here, but we got evicted this morning. I lost my job a few months ago when the kids got sick and I couldn't find anyone to watch them. I've been looking for work but without childcare." She trailed off, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Robert felt a familiar ache in his chest. These children were about the same age his grandchildren had been during their last visit to the farm, before Margaret got sick and everything changed. Miguel reminded him of his grandson with his serious expression and the way he stood protectively near his sisters. "Have you eaten today?" Robert asked. Angela shook her head. "We had some crackers this morning, but I wanted to save what little food we have for the kids." The wind picked up, and Carmen, the smallest girl, pressed closer to her mother. Robert made a decision that surprised him. "Look, I live about 10 minutes outside town. I've got a big empty house and plenty of food. Why don't you come have dinner and get warm? You can figure out your next step in the morning." Angela stared at him in disbelief. "I can't ask you to do that." "We're strangers, you didn't ask," Robert pointed out. "I'm offering. It's going to be cold tonight and those kids need to be somewhere warm." "Are you sure?" Angela's voice was barely above a whisper. "We won't be any trouble. I can cook and clean to pay you back." Robert nodded toward his truck. "Come on. We can talk more at the house." The ride to the farm was quiet except for the children's whispered conversations in the back seat. Robert glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them looking out the windows with wide eyes, taking in the countryside they were passing through. Angela sat in the front seat, clutching her bag tightly and occasionally looking over at Robert as if she couldn't believe this was happening. "You don't have to do this," she said softly as they turned into his driveway. "I know," Robert replied, "but my wife always said that helping others was just something you do when you can. She would have stopped for you too." Angela noticed he spoke about his wife in past tense but didn't ask questions. As they pulled up to the farmhouse, the children pressed their faces to the windows, amazed by the size of the house and the barn in the distance. Scout barked once from inside the house but settled down quickly. Robert unlocked the front door and ushered his unexpected guests inside. The warmth hit them immediately and all 3 children sighed with relief. "This is beautiful," Angela said, looking around the living room with its comfortable furniture and family photos on the mantel. Robert saw his home through her eyes and realized how much space he had been wasting. The house was meant for a family, not one lonely man rattling around in empty rooms. "Are you hungry?" he asked the children, and all 3 nodded enthusiastically. In the kitchen, Robert opened cabinets and tried to remember what normal families ate for dinner. He found a box of spaghetti and a jar of sauce, which seemed like something children would enjoy. Angela immediately offered to help, and soon she was boiling water, while Robert opened the sauce and searched for Parmesan cheese. The children sat at the kitchen table, finally relaxing enough to talk quietly among themselves. Miguel petted Scout gently, while Rosa and Carmen looked around the kitchen with curiosity. For the first time in months, Robert's house filled with the sounds of family life, conversations, laughter, the clatter of dishes, and the comfortable noise of people sharing a meal. As they ate, Robert learned more about Angela's situation. Her husband had left 6 months earlier, right after losing his job. She had been working as a housekeeper, but when all 3 children got sick with flu at the same time, she missed too many days and was fired. Without income, she couldn't pay rent, and they had been living in their car for the past week. "Tomorrow I'll call some places about jobs," Angela said. "We won't impose on your kindness for long." But as Robert watched the children eat with obvious hunger and saw how Angela's shoulders relaxed for the first time since he met her, He found himself hoping they might stay a little longer. The house felt alive again, filled with the warmth of human connection he had been missing for so long. The next morning, Robert woke to sounds he hadn't heard in his house for years. Soft footsteps in the hallway, whispered conversations, and the gentle closing of cabinet doors. For a moment, lying in bed with sunlight streaming through the curtains, he almost forgot that Margaret wasn't in the kitchen making coffee. Then reality settled back in, along with the memory of his unexpected house guests. He found Angela in the kitchen, quietly cleaning dishes while the children sat at the table sharing a bowl of cereal. She had found the coffee maker and had a fresh pot brewing. The sight of someone else moving comfortably through his kitchen felt strange but not unpleasant. "Good morning," Angela said softly. "I hope you don't mind that I made coffee. The children were hungry and I found some cereal in the pantry." "Of course not," Robert replied, pouring himself a cup. The coffee was stronger than he usually made it, and it tasted better somehow. "Did everyone sleep okay?" The 3 children had shared the guest room with its double bed, while Angela slept on the living room couch. Robert had offered her the spare bedroom, but she insisted the couch was fine and that she was grateful for any place warm and safe. "Like babies," Angela smiled. "They haven't slept that well in weeks. Car seats aren't very comfortable for long-term sleeping." Miguel looked up from his cereal. "Mr. Robert, do you have any animals besides the dog?" "There are some chickens out back," Robert said. "And Scout here loves to chase them, though he's too old to catch them anymore." All 3 children's eyes lit up with interest. Carmen, who had barely spoken the night before, tugged on Robert's sleeve. "Can we see the chickens?" After breakfast, Robert found himself giving a tour of the property to 3 curious children. They were fascinated by everything: the barn with its empty horse stalls, the chicken coop where 6 hens clucked and scratched in their pen, and the workshop where Robert used to build furniture and fix farm equipment. Angela followed behind, apologizing whenever the children touched something or asked too many questions. But Robert found their curiosity refreshing. It had been so long since anyone had shown interest in his farm. Miguel wanted to know how the chickens laid eggs. Rosa asked why the barn was so big if there were no horses. And Carmen was convinced that Scout was the smartest dog in the world. "We should start looking for jobs today," Angela said as they walked back toward the house. "I need to find work and a place for us to live." Robert nodded, though something inside him felt disappointed at the thought of the house returning to its previous silence. "There's no rush," he heard himself saying. "You're welcome to stay until you get on your feet." Angela stopped walking and looked at him seriously. "That's very kind, but I don't want to take advantage. You've already done so much." "You're not taking advantage," Robert said. "Honestly, it's nice to have people in the house again. It's been too quiet since my wife died." That afternoon, while the children napped in the living room, Angela and Robert sat at the kitchen table with a local newspaper, looking through job listings. Angela had worked as a housekeeper, a waitress, and a retail clerk. But most positions required immediate availability, which was difficult with 3 young children and no car. "What about the diner in town?" Robert suggested. "They might need help, and the owner is a decent man." "I could walk there if it's not too far," Angela said. "But I'd need someone to watch the kids." "I could do that," Robert offered, surprising himself. "I mean, if you wanted to apply for jobs, I could keep an eye on them here." Angela stared at him. "You would do that? You barely know us." Robert shrugged, feeling awkward under her grateful gaze. "They're good kids, and I don't have anything else to do." That evening, Robert called his daughter in California for their weekly conversation. He found himself mentioning his house guests, though he downplayed the situation to avoid worrying her. "Dad, are you sure that's safe?" his daughter asked. "You don't know anything about these people. They're a mother and 3 children," Robert said. "They needed help and I had room." "But Dad, what if they take advantage of you? What if they steal something or won't leave?" Robert looked across the living room where Angela was helping Carmen with a coloring book, while Rosa and Miguel played quietly with some old toys he had found in the closet. "They're not like that," he said firmly. The days began to develop a routine. Angela would make breakfast while Robert fed Scout and checked on the chickens. The children would explore the property under his supervision while Angela did housework, insisting on earning her keep. In the afternoon, she would walk to town looking for work, leaving the children with Robert. At first, watching 3 active 4-year-olds felt overwhelming. Robert hadn't been around young children regularly since his own grandchildren were small, and that had been years ago. But the triplets were well behaved and seemed content with simple activities. Miguel loved helping with the chickens, carefully collecting eggs and learning their names. Rosa was fascinated by Robert's workshop and asked endless questions about his tools. Carmen attached herself to Scout, following the old dog around and talking to him constantly. The house began to feel different. Toys appeared in the living room. Children's laughter echoed from the backyard. The kitchen smelled like real cooking again as Angela prepared meals with ingredients Robert had forgotten he owned. She was an excellent cook, creating delicious dinners from simple ingredients and always making sure there was enough for everyone. After a week, Angela found part-time work at the local diner, working lunch shifts 3 days a week. It wasn't much money, but it was a start. Robert found himself looking forward to her return each day, eager to hear about her interactions with customers and how the job was going. The children had settled into life on the farm with remarkable ease. They had created games around the property, turning the barn into a castle and the chicken coop into a zoo. They helped Robert with simple chores and seemed to enjoy the space and freedom after weeks of being confined to a car. But Robert knew the situation couldn't last indefinitely. Angela was saving every penny from her job, hoping to accumulate enough for a deposit on an apartment. She spent evenings looking at rental listings, though most places were either too expensive or wouldn't accept children. "There's a 2-bedroom place about 20 minutes away," she told Robert one evening. "The rent is manageable if I can find full-time work. I called the landlord and he's willing to meet with me next week." Robert nodded and tried to look encouraging, though the thought of the house returning to emptiness made his stomach clench. "That sounds promising," he managed to say. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the children's soft breathing from down the hall and Angela's quiet movements in the living room, Robert realized how much his life had changed in just 2 weeks. The grief was still there, the missing of Margaret was still sharp, but it no longer consumed every moment of his day. For the first time since Margaret's death, Robert had a reason to get up each morning beyond basic survival. The children needed breakfast, the chickens needed feeding, and there were small adventures to be had around the property. He found himself planning activities for the next day and looking forward to the conversations at dinner, but he also felt guilty about his growing attachment to this makeshift family. Was he being selfish by hoping they would stay longer? Was he trying to replace what he had lost with Margaret? And what would happen if Angela found an apartment and they moved on? Could he handle returning to the silence after experiencing this warmth again? As Robert finally drifted off to sleep, he could hear Angela moving quietly in the kitchen, probably preparing for another day of job hunting, and hoping for a future that might not include the farm that had become a temporary refuge. He wanted to tell her that she and the children could stay as long as they needed, but he wasn't sure if that offer came from kindness or from his own desperate loneliness. 3 weeks had passed since that cold October evening, when Robert first encountered Angela and her children at the food bank. What had started as one night of shelter had evolved into something none of them had expected. The farmhouse that had echoed with loneliness now buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family life. Robert discovered that he had developed a routine around the children's needs without even realizing it. He woke each morning to the sound of their whispered conversations in the guest room, followed by the patter of small feet heading to the bathroom. By the time he made it to the kitchen, Angela would have coffee ready and the children would be eating breakfast at the table that had sat mostly empty for 3 years. The changes in his daily life were remarkable. Where he once spent mornings staring out the window with his coffee, he now found himself mediating disputes over who got to feed Scout first, or explaining why chickens couldn't come inside the house, or helping small hands reach the cereal boxes on high shelves. Rosa had claimed his workshop as her special place. She would stand in the doorway, watching with fascination as Robert worked on small projects. Her questions were endless and surprisingly thoughtful for a 4-year-old. "Why do you use that saw instead of the other one?" she asked one afternoon, pointing to his handsaw. "This one gives me more control for detailed work," Robert explained, showing her how he guided the blade carefully along a pencil line. "Can you teach me?" Rosa asked, her dark eyes serious. Robert hesitated. The workshop was full of sharp tools and potential dangers. But Rosa's genuine interest reminded him of his own curiosity as a child, when his grandfather had taught him basic woodworking skills. "Maybe we can start with something simple," he said, "like sanding. That's how I learned when I was young." Rosa's face lit up with joy, and from that day forward, She became his workshop assistant. Robert found himself looking forward to their afternoon sessions, where he would set up safe tasks for her while explaining the basics of measuring, cutting, and joining wood. Her enthusiasm reminded him why he had fallen in love with woodworking in the first place. Miguel had claimed the animals as his domain. Every morning he would follow Robert to the chicken coop, carrying the small container of feed and scattering it with the seriousness of an experienced farmer. He had named each chicken and could identify them by their different markings and personalities. "Henrietta is the boss," he explained to Robert one morning, pointing to a large red hen. "She always eats first and keeps the others in line." "How can you tell?" Robert asked, genuinely curious about Miguel's observations. "Watch how the others wait for her to start eating," Miguel said, "and see how she stands taller. That's how you know who's in charge." Robert was impressed by the boy's attention to detail and natural understanding of animal behavior. Miguel had also taken over the egg collecting, carefully placing each one in the basket and reporting the daily count to Angela, as if it were important farm business. Carmen, the quietest of the three, had formed an unlikely friendship with Scout. The old border collie, who had spent months lying listlessly on his bed, now followed Carmen around the property with renewed energy. She would sit by his side and talk to him constantly, sharing her thoughts about everything from the clouds in the sky to her favorite breakfast cereal. "Scout is a good listener," Carmen told Robert one afternoon as they sat on the front porch steps. "What do you talk to him about?" Robert asked. "Everything," Carmen said seriously. "I tell him about the chickens and the big barn and how nice you are to let us live here. And I tell him about Mama working at the restaurant and how she's not sad anymore." Robert felt a tightness in his chest at Carmen's simple honesty. He had noticed that Angela did seem less stressed than when they first met. The constant worry lines around her eyes had softened, and she laughed more easily now. Angela had settled into life on the farm with a natural grace that amazed Robert. She cooked meals that filled the house with delicious smells, turning simple ingredients into feasts. She had taken over the laundry, insisting that it was the least she could do. Most surprisingly, she had begun tending the small vegetable garden near the back door, pulling weeds and preparing the beds for winter. "I used to help my grandmother with her garden when I was little," she explained when Robert found her working in the dirt one afternoon. "I forgot how much I missed it." Her presence in the kitchen reminded Robert of the rhythm of shared meals and conversation. Angela would tell him about her day at the diner while she cooked, sharing stories about regular customers and the other staff. Robert found himself actually looking forward to dinner, not just for the food but for the company and conversation. The children had brought a different kind of energy to mealtimes. They chattered about their discoveries around the farm, asked endless questions about how things worked, and turned every dinner into a small celebration. Robert realized he had forgotten how much joy children could find in simple things. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Rosa announced that she was going to build a house for Scout when she got bigger. "It will have windows and a real door," she said seriously, "and a little kitchen so he can make his own food." "Dogs can't cook," Miguel pointed out logically. "Scout is special," Carmen interjected. "He's smart enough to learn." Robert found himself laughing harder than he had in years, caught up in their innocent debate about Scout's potential culinary skills. Angela smiled at him from across the table, and for a moment, the scene felt so natural and right that Robert almost forgot this wasn't his permanent family. But reality had a way of intruding on comfortable moments. Angela continued to search for full-time work and a permanent place to live. She had found a small apartment that might work, and the landlord was willing to hold it for 2 weeks while she saved for the security deposit. "It's not much," she told Robert one evening after the children were in bed. "2 bedrooms, but it's clean and safe. The schools nearby have good reputations." Robert nodded, trying to look supportive. "That sounds perfect for you and the kids." "I can't believe how much our lives have changed since we met you," Angela continued. "A month ago, we were sleeping in my car and wondering where our next meal would come from. Now the children are happy and healthy, I have a job, and we might actually have a real home again. You've all brought something to this place too," Robert said quietly. "It was pretty lonely here before you came." Angela looked around the living room where toys were scattered on the coffee table and children's drawings decorated the refrigerator. "It's hard to imagine this house being lonely. It feels so full of life." Robert wanted to tell her that it had been like a tomb before they arrived, that he had been existing rather than living, that their presence had reminded him what joy felt like. But he didn't want to make her feel guilty for planning to leave or obligated to stay because of his emotional needs. That night, Robert lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of his houseguests settling in for sleep. Carmen was whispering to Rosa about something that had happened at the chicken coop. Miguel was asking Angela a question about tomorrow's plans. Scout was making his rounds, checking on everyone before settling in his bed. These sounds had become as comforting to Robert as a lullaby. The house felt alive and purposeful again. But he knew that Angela was right to plan for independence. She had her own life to build, and he couldn't expect her to stay just because he had grown attached to their company. Still, as Robert drifted off to sleep, he found himself hoping that maybe, just maybe, Angela's apartment search wouldn't work out quite yet. He wasn't ready to return to the silence, and from what he could see, the children were thriving on the farm. Perhaps there was a way for this temporary arrangement to last a little longer, though he wasn't sure how to suggest it without seeming selfish or inappropriate. For now, he would treasure each day with his unexpected family and try not to think too much about the inevitable goodbye that was coming. Word travels fast in small farming communities, and it didn't take long for people in town to notice that Robert Chen was no longer the solitary figure he had been since Margaret's death. The first sign came when Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store commented on his dramatically different shopping habits. "My goodness. Robert," she said as she rang up his cart full of fresh vegetables, children's cereal, and family-sized portions of meat. "Planning a big dinner party?" Robert felt his face warm as he realized how obvious the change must be. For 3 years, his grocery trips had consisted of items for one person, single servings, frozen dinners, and the basics. Now his cart looked like that of a family man again. "I have some house guests," he said simply, not wanting to explain the whole situation while other customers waited in line behind him. But Mrs. Peterson's raised eyebrows told him the story wouldn't end there. By the next day, half the town seemed to know that Robert had people staying at his farm, though the details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story. The truth emerged gradually as Angela became more visible in town during her shifts at the diner and her errands with the children. People began to piece together that the quiet widower had taken in a young mother and her triplets. The reactions were mixed, and Robert found himself at the center of more attention than he had received in years. Some neighbors expressed genuine concern for his well-being. Mrs. Henderson from the church stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a casserole but clearly hoping to assess the situation for herself. "Robert, honey," she said, peering past him into the living room where children's toys were scattered on the coffee table. "Are you sure you know what you're doing? Taking in strangers can be risky, especially with children involved." "They're not strangers anymore," Robert replied, accepting the casserole with thanks but not inviting her inside. "They're friends who needed help." Mrs. Henderson's expression suggested she had more questions, but the sound of children's laughter from the backyard seemed to reassure her somewhat. "Well, if you need anything or if things become too much to handle, you know we're here to help." Other reactions were less supportive. Robert overheard whispered conversations at the hardware store about whether he was being taken advantage of, whether the situation was appropriate, and what his deceased wife would have thought about the arrangement. Some people seemed to think he was being foolish or naive, while others suggested his judgment might be clouded by loneliness. The criticism stung more than Robert expected. He began to second-guess his decision to help Angela and her children, wondering if people were right to question his motives and judgment. Was he being irresponsible? Was he putting himself at risk? Most painfully, would Margaret have approved of his choices? But for every critical voice, there seemed to be someone ready to offer support. Tom Rodriguez, who owned the diner where Angela worked, stopped by the farm one evening to check on things. "That woman is one of the hardest workers I've ever hired," he told Robert as they sat on the front porch. "She's never late, never complains, and the customers love her. You did a good thing helping her out." "I'm not sure everyone sees it that way," Robert said, still smarting from some of the comments he'd heard in town. "People always have opinions," Tom shrugged. "Most of them don't know what they're talking about. I can see the difference in Angela since she started working for me. She was desperate and scared when she first came in looking for a job. Now she has hope again. That's worth something." The children's integration into the community happened more naturally. Angela had enrolled them in the local elementary school, where their teacher, Miss Carter, was impressed by their eagerness to learn and their polite behavior. The triplets had quickly made friends with other children, and their presence at school pickup and community events began to feel normal. The breakthrough moment came during the annual Harvest Festival at the community center. Robert hadn't attended since Margaret died, but Angela convinced him to take the family. The children were excited about the promised games and activities, and Angela thought it would be good for them to participate in community events. Robert felt nervous as they walked into the decorated hall, aware that many eyes were on their unusual group. But the children's excitement was infectious, and soon they were dragging him from booth to booth, wanting to try every game and activity. At the ring toss game, Miguel struggled to land any rings on the bottles. Robert found himself kneeling beside the boy, showing him how to adjust his aim and follow through with his throw. When Miguel finally succeeded, his whoop of joy drew smiles from nearby families. Meanwhile, Rosa had discovered the craft table, where volunteers were helping children make corn husk dolls. She worked with intense concentration, asking detailed questions about the process and helping younger children with their projects. Her natural helpfulness and curiosity charmed the adult volunteers. Carmen had found the petting zoo, where a local farmer had brought gentle animals for children to touch and feed. She stood patiently in line, then spent long minutes carefully petting a rabbit while asking the farmer questions about how to care for it. Angela circulated among the booths, helping where she could and chatting with other parents. Her warmth and friendliness gradually broke down the barriers that Robert had worried about. People began to see her not as a stranger who had taken advantage of their neighbor, but as a single mother working hard to rebuild her life. The turning point came when the local volunteer fire department needed help carrying supplies from their truck. Without being asked, Angela immediately pitched in, organizing other volunteers and coordinating the effort efficiently. Her take-charge attitude and genuine desire to help impressed everyone who worked with her. Later, during the traditional group photos, several families invited Robert and his group to join them. The children naturally gravitated toward other kids their age, and Angela found herself in conversation with other mothers about school activities and childcare challenges. "Those kids are lucky to have found you," said Janet Miller, whose daughter had befriended Rosa at school. "And honestly, you look happier than I've seen you since Margaret passed." That comment stuck with Robert as they drove home that evening, the children chattering excitedly about their prizes and new friends. He did feel happier, more engaged with life and the community around him. The Harvest Festival had reminded him of the social connections he had abandoned after Margaret's death. Over the following weeks, invitations began to arrive. The children were invited to birthday parties and playdates. Angela was asked to join the parent-teacher organization at school. Robert found himself included in community activities he hadn't participated in for years. Mrs. Williams from church approached him one Sunday with a proposal. "We're organizing a Thanksgiving dinner for families who might not otherwise have a big celebration," she said. "Would you and your family like to help? We could use Angela's cooking skills, and the children might enjoy helping with decorations." The casual way she referred to Angela and the children as his family made Robert's chest tighten with emotion. Without really trying, they had become accepted as a unit, a family in the eyes of their community. But acceptance brought its own complications. Robert realized that the more integrated they became in local life, the harder it would be when Angela found permanent housing and they moved away. The children had friends now, Angela had connections, and Robert had rediscovered his place in the community. How could they untangle all of these relationships when the time came? That evening, as he helped Carmen practice writing her letters at the kitchen table, while Angela prepared dinner and Rosa and Miguel played with Scout in the living room, Robert felt the weight of impending change. The apartment Angela had been saving for was almost within reach financially. Soon she would have enough for the deposit and first month's rent. The community had accepted them as a family, but they weren't really a family. They were temporary housemates who had grown attached to each other. Robert wondered if he was being fair to any of them by letting these bonds grow deeper when he knew they would eventually be broken. But as he looked around the warm, busy kitchen and listened to the comfortable sounds of evening routine, Robert couldn't bring himself to regret the path that had led them all to this moment. Whatever happened next, they had given each other something precious during this time together. For Angela and the children, it was stability and hope. For Robert, it was a return to life and purpose after years of merely existing. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in November, just as Robert was helping Miguel collect eggs from the chicken coop. His son David's voice carried clearly across the yard from the house where Robert had left his phone on the kitchen counter. "Dad, are you there? I've been trying to reach you for an hour." Robert hurried inside, motioning for Miguel to follow with the basket of eggs. Angela looked up from where she was packing lunches for the children, concern evident on her face. "Sorry, I was outside," Robert said into the phone. "What's going on?" "I'm flying in this weekend," David announced. "Jennifer and I are worried about you and we need to talk." Robert's stomach dropped. His children had been calling more frequently lately, asking pointed questions about his living situation and expressing concern about what they heard from neighbors and family friends. Word had clearly reached them about his house guests and they were not pleased. "That's not necessary," Robert said. "Everything is fine here." "Dad, we know you have strangers living in your house," David said bluntly. "People are talking. Mrs. Henderson called Jennifer and told her you've basically adopted a family you know nothing about. We're worried you're being taken advantage of." Robert glanced at Angela, who was pretending not to listen while helping Rosa find her backpack. The children were gathering their school supplies, chattering about their plans for the day. This scene of domestic normalcy was exactly what David would see as evidence of his father's poor judgment. "We'll discuss it when you get here," Robert said finally, not wanting to have this conversation in front of the family who had become so important to him. After he hung up, Angela approached him carefully. "Is everything okay? Your son sounded upset." "He's worried about me," Robert said honestly. "He thinks I'm making poor decisions." Angela's face fell. "Because of us. We should leave before he arrives." "I don't want to cause problems with your family." "No," Robert said more firmly than he intended. "This is my house and my decision. David can voice his concerns, but you and the children aren't going anywhere just because he disapproves." But even as he said the words, Robert felt doubt creeping in. Was David right? Had his loneliness clouded his judgment? He looked around the kitchen that had become so lively and warm, trying to imagine it empty again. The thought made him feel sick, but maybe that was exactly the problem. Maybe he was being selfish, keeping Angela and the children here because he needed them more than they needed him. That afternoon, while the children were at school and Angela was at work, Robert found himself in Margaret's sewing room, a small space off the master bedroom that he had barely entered since her death. Her fabric collection still filled the shelves, and her sewing machine sat ready for projects that would never be completed. He sat in her favorite chair and tried to imagine what Margaret would say about his current situation. She had always been the one with better instincts about people, the one who could see through pretense and recognize genuine need. Would she think he was being wise or foolish? "What should I do, Maggie?" he said aloud, using the nickname he had called her since they were young. "Our kids think I've lost my mind, but these people have brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever." The room was silent except for the ticking of Margaret's small mantel clock. But as Robert sat there, surrounded by evidence of his wife's creativity and generosity, he began to remember things about her that grief had temporarily obscured. Margaret had always opened their home to people in need. She had taken in her elderly aunt for 6 months when the woman couldn't live alone anymore. She had housed a young cousin during a difficult divorce. She had never turned away anyone who genuinely needed help. Margaret would have brought Angela and the children home that night at the food bank without a second thought. She probably would have done it faster than Robert had, and she certainly wouldn't have worried about what the neighbors thought. The realization brought both comfort and renewed uncertainty. If Margaret would have helped them, that validated his decision. But Margaret was gone, and Robert was navigating this alone with responsibilities to his own family to consider as well. Friday afternoon brought David's arrival, along with his wife, Jennifer. Robert met them at the door, steeling himself for a difficult conversation. David looked like a man on a mission, his jaw set and his expression serious. Jennifer seemed more sympathetic but equally concerned. "Where are they?" David asked without preamble, looking around the living room that showed clear evidence of children's presence. "Angela is at work, and the children are at school." Robert said. They'll be home soon. Good. We need to talk before they get back. David sat down heavily on the couch. Dad, what are you thinking? You've taken in complete strangers. You don't know anything about their background, their history, whether they're telling you the truth about their situation. I know enough, Robert replied. I know that Angela works hard, that she's a good mother, and that those children are polite, well-behaved, and happy here. But what do you really know? Jennifer interjected gently. Have you done any kind of background check? Do you know why her husband really left? Are you sure she's not running from something? The questions hit Robert like physical blows because he realized he couldn't answer them definitively. He had taken Angela's story at face value because it felt true and because he wanted to help. But his children were raising legitimate concerns about safety and judgment. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts, Robert said, but he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Your instincts might be compromised by loneliness, David said bluntly. You've been isolated here for 3 years and suddenly you have a ready-made family. Don't you think that might affect your judgment? Before Robert could answer, they heard voices at the front door. The children had returned from school and Angela was with them, having finished her shift at the diner. Robert watched his son's face as Miguel, Rosa, and Carmen burst through the door, full of excitement about their day. Mr. Robert, Rosa called out. Look what I made in art class. She held up a clay pot painted in bright colors. That's beautiful, Robert said, accepting the pot and admiring her work. You're getting very good at this. The children noticed David and Jennifer and immediately became more subdued, sensing the tension in the room. Angela appeared behind them, taking in the scene quickly. You must be Robert's son, she said to David, extending her hand. I'm Angela. These are my children, Rosa, Miguel, and Carmen. David shook her hand politely but coolly. Nice to meet you. An awkward silence filled the room. The children looked between the adults, clearly sensing something was wrong but not understanding what. Carmen moved closer to Robert, taking his hand in the way she did when she felt uncertain. Why don't you kids go wash up for dinner? Angela suggested gently. And maybe feed Scout. He's been waiting for you all day. After the children left the room, Angela turned to face David and Jennifer directly. I know you're worried about your father, she said quietly. I understand that this situation must seem strange to you, but I want you to know that we're grateful for his kindness and we're not trying to take advantage of him. What exactly is your plan here? David asked. How long do you intend to stay? Angela glanced at Robert and he could see the hurt in her eyes at the hostile tone. I've been saving money for an apartment, she said. I should have enough for a deposit within the next few weeks. We never intended this to be permanent, but it's become comfortable, hasn't it? Jennifer suggested. Free housing, built-in babysitting, a stable environment for your children. Why would you want to leave? Robert saw Angela's cheeks flush with embarrassment and anger, and he felt his own temper rising. That's enough, he said sharply. Angela has been nothing but grateful and helpful. She cooks, cleans, and contributes to this household in every way possible. Dad, we're not trying to be cruel, David said. We're trying to protect you. This woman shows up with a sob story about being homeless, and suddenly she's living in your house with her 3 children. Can't you see how that looks? It looks like someone helping people who needed help, Robert said firmly. It looks like what your mother would have done without hesitation. The mention of Margaret seemed to hit David like a slap. His expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. Mom would have been careful too. She would have made sure she knew who she was helping. That evening, after a tense dinner where the children picked up on the uncomfortable atmosphere, Robert found himself torn between his loyalty to Angela and his children's concerns. Were David and Jennifer right? Had his loneliness made him vulnerable to manipulation, or were they simply unable to understand the genuine connection he had formed with this family who had stumbled into his life? As he lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of his house guests settling in for sleep, Robert realized he faced an impossible choice. He could side with his biological family and ask Angela to leave, protecting himself from potential harm, but returning to the loneliness that had nearly consumed him. Or he could trust his instincts and defend the family that had brought joy back into his life, risking his relationship with his own children. The crisis came on a Thursday morning in early December, arriving in the form of a knock on Robert's door at 8:30 in the morning. Angela had just left for her shift at the diner, and the children were getting ready for school when Robert opened the door to find a woman in a business suit holding a clipboard and wearing an official-looking badge. "Mr. Chen, I'm Patricia Williams from Social Services. I'm here to conduct a welfare check on the Rodriguez children." Robert's blood ran cold. "A welfare check? What's this about?" "We received a report of concern about children living in an irregular housing situation," the woman said, consulting her clipboard. "May I come in?" Robert's mind raced as he let her inside. Someone had called social services about Angela and the children. The timing, just days after David's visit, seemed too coincidental to ignore, though his son had left without resolving their conflict about the living arrangement. "Children?" Ms. Williams called out, "I need to speak with you." Rosa, Miguel, and Carmen appeared in the living room, their backpacks ready for school. They looked confused and slightly frightened by the official-looking stranger in their temporary home. "Are you Rosa, Miguel, and Carmen Rodriguez?" Ms. Williams asked kindly. When they nodded, she continued, "I need to ask you some questions about where you live and how you're being cared for." Robert watched helplessly as the social worker questioned the children about their living situation, their relationship with him, and whether they felt safe in the house. The children answered honestly but seemed bewildered by the interrogation. Rosa kept looking at Robert as if asking for help, while Miguel stood protectively near his sisters. "Where is your mother?" Ms. Williams asked. "Mama works at the restaurant," Carmen said quietly. "She makes food for people." "And who takes care of you when she's working?" "Mr. Robert does," Miguel said. "He helps us with homework and shows us the chickens." Ms. Williams made notes on her clipboard, her expression neutral but professional. "How long have you been living here?" The children looked uncertain about the time frame, so Robert stepped forward. "About 2 months," he said. "Their mother and I have an informal arrangement while she gets back on her feet." "And what is your relationship to these children, Mr. Chen?" "I'm a friend helping a family in need," Robert said. Hearing how inadequate that sounded in the face of official scrutiny, Ms. Williams continued her questions, asking about sleeping arrangements, meals, supervision, and whether any adults other than Angela and Robert had access to the children. Robert answered as thoroughly as possible, but he could see that the situation looked problematic from an official perspective. 3 children living with an unrelated adult male, with no formal custody arrangement or background checks. "I'll need to speak with Ms. Rodriguez as well," the social worker said. "In the meantime, I need to document the living conditions here." She photographed the children's bedroom, the kitchen, and common areas. Robert was grateful that Angela kept the house immaculate and that the children's room was tidy and appropriate. But he knew that wasn't really the issue. The problem was the informal, unofficial nature of their arrangement. "Can you call your mother?" Miss Williams asked the children. "I need her to come home right away." Robert called the diner, and Tom agreed to let Angela leave immediately. She arrived 20 minutes later, her face white with panic and her hands shaking as she hugged her children. "What's happening?" she asked. "Are you taking my children?" "I'm investigating a report of concern," Ms. Williams explained. "Someone called our hotline saying that 3 young children were living in an unstable situation with an adult male who wasn't their relative." Angela's eyes flashed with anger. "These children are perfectly safe. Mr. Robert has been nothing but kind to us. He's given us a home when we had nowhere else to go." "I understand your gratitude," the social worker said, "but informal arrangements like this raise safety concerns. Do you have any legal documentation of this arrangement? Has Mr. Chen undergone a background check?" "We don't need legal documentation," Angela said desperately. "He's not their guardian. I'm their mother, and I'm here with them. But you work during the day, leaving the children in his unsupervised care. Without proper vetting, that creates a risk situation." Robert watched Angela's face crumble as she realized the implications. Her part-time job at the diner was essential to her plan for independence, but it also made her vulnerable to accusations of inadequate supervision. "What are you saying?" Angela whispered. "I'm saying that without proper documentation and safety measures, I may need to place the children in temporary protective custody while we sort this out." The words hit the room like a bomb. Carmen started crying immediately, while Rosa and Miguel pressed closer to their mother. Angela looked like she might collapse. "No," Robert said firmly, stepping forward. "These children are safe, loved, and well cared for. You can't break up this family over paperwork." "Mr. Chen, I understand your concern, but what would it take?" Robert interrupted. What kind of documentation or arrangements would satisfy your requirements? Ms. Williams consulted her clipboard again. Ideally, there would be a formal custody arrangement, background checks on any adults providing care, and documentation of stable housing and income. Then let's do that, Robert said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Angela stared at him in shock. Robert, you can't. Yes, I can, he said firmly. These children belong with their mother, and if that means making this arrangement official, then that's what we'll do. Ms. Williams looked surprised by Robert's immediate response. Mr. Chen, are you saying you want to become a legal guardian or caretaker for these children? If that's what it takes to keep them safe and together, yes. The social worker made more notes. This would involve extensive background checks, home inspections, and legal proceedings. It's not a simple process. I don't care how complicated it is, Robert said. What matters is that this family stays together. Angela was crying now, overwhelmed by Robert's willingness to undergo legal scrutiny for the sake of her children. The kids seemed confused by all the adult conversation, but clearly understood that their security was being threatened. I'll need to file my report, Ms. Williams said. But given Mr. Chen's willingness to pursue legal arrangements and the obvious care being provided to the children, I'm comfortable allowing them to remain here temporarily while we begin the formal process. After the social worker left with promises to return for follow-up visits, the house felt shaken. The children went to school late, still confused and upset by the morning's events. Angela sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. I can't let you do this, she said. Become their legal guardian? That's a huge responsibility and commitment. You didn't sign up for that. Maybe not originally, Robert admitted, but things change. These kids have become important to me. You've become important to me. I'm not going to let some bureaucratic process tear apart what we've built here. But your own children already think you're making poor decisions. What will they say about this? Robert thought about David's concerns and Jennifer's warnings. They would probably see this as confirmation of their worst fears about his judgment. But as he looked around the kitchen where the children had eaten breakfast that morning, where Angela had packed their lunches with care, where they had all shared countless meals and conversations, Robert knew his priorities. My children are adults with their own lives, he said. These kids need protection and stability right now. I can't abandon them just because it's complicated. That evening, Robert called David to explain the situation before he heard about it from other sources. The conversation went exactly as badly as he had expected. Dad, this is insane, David said. You're talking about becoming the legal guardian of 3 children you've known for 2 months. Have you completely lost your mind? I'm talking about helping a family that needs help, Robert replied. Something your mother would have supported completely. Don't use Mom to justify this, David said angrily. She wouldn't have put herself at legal and financial risk like this. She would have helped them find appropriate resources, not adopted them. I'm not adopting them. I'm providing a stable home while their mother gets on her feet. For how long? What happens when they're teenagers? When they have problems you can't handle? When Angela decides she wants to move on, you'll be legally responsible for children who aren't yours. Robert didn't have good answers to these questions, and David's concerns echoed his own doubts. But when he looked at the children's drawings on his refrigerator, when he remembered Carmen's trust and Rosa's excitement about woodworking, and Miguel's pride in caring for the chickens, he knew he couldn't abandon them. I'm doing what feels right, Robert said finally. You're doing what feels good, David corrected. There's a difference, and it's going to end badly for everyone involved. After he hung up, Robert sat in his quiet living room and wondered if his son was right. Was he being foolish and impulsive? Was he putting everyone at risk for the sake of his own emotional needs? But then Angela came downstairs after tucking the children into bed, her eyes still red from crying, but her expression determined. I've been thinking, she said, if you're really willing to go through this legal process. Spring arrived at the farm with a burst of color that seemed to mirror the transformation in Robert's life. 6 months had passed since the social services crisis, and the legal arrangements that had once seemed so daunting had settled into a comfortable routine. The formal guardianship papers were filed, the background checks were complete, and Angela paid monthly rent that made their partnership official and dignified. But the real changes went much deeper than paperwork. The vegetable garden that had grown wild after Margaret's death now flourished under Angela's care, with help from 3 enthusiastic young assistants. Carmen had claimed the strawberry patch as her special responsibility, checking daily for ripe berries and proudly bringing them to the breakfast table. Miguel had expanded the herb section, learning the names and uses of different plants with the same intensity he brought to caring for the chickens. Rosa had convinced Robert to build raised beds specifically for flowers, wanting to add beauty alongside the practical vegetables. "Look, Mr. Robert," Carmen called out on a warm April morning, holding up a perfect strawberry. "The first one this year." Robert paused in his work repairing the garden fence to admire her discovery. The sight of her dirt-stained hands and beaming smile reminded him powerfully of Margaret, who had found the same joy in growing things. But instead of the sharp pain that such memories used to bring, Robert felt a warm continuation, as if Margaret's love of the garden lived on through Carmen's enthusiasm. The house itself had evolved to accommodate its expanded family. Robert had built bunk beds for the boys' room when Miguel decided he wanted his own space, leaving the girls to share the original guest room. His workshop had gained a small workbench at child height, where Rosa continued to learn woodworking skills with remarkable patience and precision. The living room had been rearranged to include a homework station, where all three children could work on school projects. Under Angela's supervision, Angela had enrolled in nursing classes at the community college, attending 2 evenings a week while Robert watched the children. Her determination to build a career that could support her family impressed everyone who met her. The dean of the nursing program had specifically mentioned her dedication and natural compassion for patient care. "I never thought I'd be able to go back to school," Angela told Robert one evening as she studied for an anatomy exam at the kitchen table. "When we were living in the car, getting an education seemed impossible. Now look where we are." Robert looked around the kitchen where children's artwork covered the refrigerator, where Scout dozed contentedly at Carmen's feet, where the scent of Angela's homemade bread filled the air. It was impossible to remember what the house had felt like when it was empty and silent. The community had fully embraced this unconventional family. At the spring school carnival, Robert found himself volunteering alongside other parents, helping Rosa with the ring toss game while Miguel showed off his face painting skills, and Carmen won a prize for having the loudest cheer at the cakewalk. Teachers and other parents greeted them as a natural unit, and the children's friends came to the farm for playdates and birthday parties. Robert's relationship with his own children had slowly improved, though it required patience from everyone involved. David and Jennifer visited for Easter, bringing their own children to meet their step-cousins as the kids had started calling each other. The initial tension gave way to curiosity as David watched his father interact with Rosa. "Miguel and Carmen, I've never seen you so relaxed," Jennifer observed quietly as they watched Robert teach Miguel how to use a level in the workshop, while Rosa and Carmen painted flower pots nearby. "I feel useful again," Robert admitted. "I'd forgotten what it was like to be needed." David had been slower to accept the arrangement, but a conversation with Angela during their Easter visit had shifted his perspective. She had been direct about her gratitude but also clear about her own goals and timeline. "I'm not here forever," she told David honestly. "I'm building a career and saving money. Eventually, I want to buy my own house, maybe here in the community where the kids have friends and roots. But right now, this partnership works for all of us. Your father gets companionship and purpose, and my children get stability and a positive male role model." "What about when they're teenagers?" David asked, echoing his earlier concerns. "Then we'll figure it out together," Angela said simply. That's what families do. The word family had indeed taken on new meaning for all of them. It wasn't defined by blood or law, but by daily care, shared responsibilities, and genuine affection. Robert found himself thinking of Margaret often, but now the memories brought comfort rather than pain. He had started talking to the children about her, sharing stories of her life and her love for the farm. "Mrs. Margaret would have loved you," he told Carmen one afternoon as they picked strawberries together. "She always said the garden was meant to be shared. Do you think she's happy that we're here?" Carmen asked with the directness that only young children possess. Robert paused, considering the question seriously. "I think she would be very happy to see this place full of life and laughter again." The anniversary of Margaret's death fell on a Tuesday in May. For the first time since her passing, Robert didn't spend the day in solitary grief. Instead, Angela and the children helped him plant a memorial garden in her honor. with roses and herbs that would bloom every year in her memory. They shared stories about her life, and Robert felt her presence not as an absence but as a continuation. "She sounds like she was a wonderful woman," Angela said, as they finished planting the last rose bush. "She was," Robert agreed, "and she would have loved all of you." That evening, the children presented Robert with a handmade book they had created at school, titled Our Family Story. Each page contained drawings and short paragraphs about their life at the farm, from Rosa's first woodworking project, to Miguel's expertise with the chickens, to Carmen's friendship with Scout. The final page showed all of them together at the kitchen table, with the caption, "A family is people who take care of each other." Robert felt tears running down his cheeks as he read their simple but profound definition of family. It captured something that all the legal documents and formal arrangements couldn't express: the daily choice to love and care for each other, regardless of how they had come together. As summer approached, Angela received news that she had been accepted into the accelerated nursing program that would allow her to complete her degree in 18 months instead of 3 years. The program was demanding but would qualify her for better-paying positions at the regional hospital. "Are you sure you want to take on more?" Robert asked, knowing how hard she already worked between her job, classes, and parenting responsibilities. "I want to build something lasting," Angela said. "Not just for me, but for the kids. They deserve a mother who can support them independently, even if we're living here together." Robert understood her need for self-sufficiency, even within their partnership. It was one of the things he most admired about her, the determination to contribute and build rather than simply receive help. The first anniversary of their meeting at the food bank passed quietly, marked only by Robert's private reflection on how much had changed. A year ago, he had been a lonely widower going through the motions of living. Now he woke each morning to the sounds of family life, spent his days engaged in meaningful activities, and fell asleep feeling grateful for the day's small joys and challenges. On a warm evening in June, Robert sat on the front porch watching Angela help the children with a science project in the yard. Scout lay at his feet, content and alert despite his advancing age. The garden grew green and lush in the distance. The chickens scratched happily in their expanded coop, and the old farmhouse hummed with the energy of people who had chosen to build a life together. Margaret's empty chair had been replaced by a porch swing that could hold the whole family during evening conversations. Her coffee mug had been joined by others in the cabinet, each one representing a person who belonged in this house. Her memory lived on not as a shrine to the past, but as inspiration for continued love and generosity. Robert realized that healing didn't mean forgetting or replacing what had been lost. Instead, it meant opening his heart wide enough to hold both the love he had shared with Margaret and the new love he had discovered with Angela and her children. Love, he had learned, was not diminished when shared. It multiplied. As the children's laughter carried across the yard and Angela's voice joined their excited chatter about tomorrow's field trip, Robert understood that this was what Margaret would have wanted for him. Not a life frozen in memory, but a life continued with purpose and joy. She had taught him how to love deeply, and that lesson had prepared him to recognize and embrace the family that had found him when he needed them most. The future stretched ahead with its usual uncertainties. The children would grow and change, Angela would finish her nursing program and build her career, and new challenges would certainly arise. But they would face whatever came together, as a family bound not by blood or law, but by the daily choice to care for each other. Robert had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as interruptions to our planned lives.